Hi, I'm Lynn McBee with EarthX, and I have the pleasure of introducing Katherine Coleman Flowers today. Katherine Coleman Flowers is an internationally recognized environmental activist, MacArthur Genius Grant recipient, and author. She has dedicated her life's work to advocating for environmental justice, primarily equal access to clean water and functional sanitation for communities across the United States. Founder of the Center for Rural Enterprise and Environmental Justice, Flowers has spent her career promoting equal access to clean water, air, sanitation, and soil to reduce health and economic disparities in marginalized rural communities. In addition, Flowers serves as Rural Development Manager for Brian Stevenson's Equal Justice Initiative, is a Senior Fellow for the Center for Earth Ethics at Union Theological Seminary, and sits on the Board of Directors for the Climate Reality Project, the National Resources Defense Council, and the Center for Constitutional Rights. In 2021, her leadership and fervor in fighting for solutions to these issues led her to one of the most notable appointments yet, Vice Chair of the Biden administration's inaugural White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. As the author of Waste, One Woman's Fight Against America's Dirty Secret, Flowers shares her inspiring story of advocacy from childhood to environmental justice champion. She discusses sanitation as its correlation with systemic class, racial, and geographic prejudice that affects people across the United States. She has been featured in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Bloomberg, The Guardian, and on PBS. We're going to hear from Katherine in 1 minute, and then we have my colleague, Matt Tranchen, our Senior VP of Impact, that's going to do a Q&A. So, Katherine, it's a pleasure to be with you, and you're so accomplished, and we're so wonderful for you to share your story.
Well, thank you so much. It's really an honor for me to be here. I just think that, as you know, coming from Lowndes County, Alabama, a very rural community located between Selma and Montgomery, the attention to this work that has been garnered in the last few years is an example of a value that I was raised with, that in America we can accomplish anything we set out to do. And likewise, as a country girl growing up in Lowndes County, I never thought that I would become the environmental activist that I've become, and to get the kind of support and help that I've gotten around the country. So thank you, EarthX, for allowing me to have this opportunity. I'd like to start today by talking about why this is so important. And this is important largely because as we look at the Sustainable Development Goals, especially Sustainable Development Goal number 6, the human right to water and sanitation, one would assume that in the United States of America, the wealthiest country in the world, that everyone would have the access to water and sanitation, which I believe is a human right. However, it became apparent during the Flint crisis that this is not true. But Flint is just one of many communities around the country that does not have access to clean water. And Lowndes County is just one of the many communities in the U.S. that does not have access to sanitation. And I like to cite a few examples, and I also like to talk about what some of the solutions could potentially be. Well, first of all, in the news recently, there's another Flint. It is called Benton Harbor, Michigan, that have some of the same footprints of what we saw in Flint, a community that was taken over by an emergency manager. And then all of a sudden, because of choices and decisions that were made based on money, people ended up with contaminated water. And they're saying that the evidence shows that the contamination in Benton Harbor is much worse than it was in Flint at its height. Why do we continue to have these problems? In Lowndes County, Alabama, people are straight piping. In other words, they're flushing their toilets and the effluent is going out onto the ground. In addition to that, there are people that have paid for sanitation, for wastewater treatment that has been approved. All the plans have to be approved by the state of Alabama. They have been approved, the systems have been installed, but yet they fail and the sewage is coming back into the homes. Why is this a problem? It's a problem because we're seeing it more and more in marginalized communities, communities of color, or in poor communities, like in places in Kentucky, where my friend Nina McCord is an activist, where they're having water and sanitation issues, or in West Virginia, where they've had issues for years. And I remember one of the first meetings that I attended many years ago to talk about wastewater. There were activists there from, I was actually in Roanoke, Virginia, and there were activists there from West Virginia that told me that a lot of the creeks and streams in West Virginia were polluted by human feces. But yet in West Virginia, we also see where there's severe mountaintop removal, where the tops are blown off the mountains to get to a vein of coal. And none of this is not only not good for the environment, but it's not good for human health either. The other place that I've been to recently where I've seen sanitation issues is Mount Vernon, New York, about 30 minutes from Times Square, a community with beautiful old homes, a community that was built, they started building back in the 1600s. Yet, whenever people have problems there with wastewater, it's because it's coming back into their basements and into their homes. The same issues that we see in other places. In Lowndes County, the disparity is because people there never got the adequate infrastructure in place to address these problems. In Mount Vernon, the problem is aging infrastructure. The infrastructure there is over 100 years old. There are clay pipes that are at least 100 feet underground. They don't even know where they're located, yet they're failing. And whenever we have these climate events like Hurricane Ida, people, when we saw Hurricane Ida, it came ashore in Louisiana. And yes, people in those areas have wastewater and water issues too, because of climate change, but also because of the failing infrastructure. But Hurricane Ida didn't stop on the Gulf Coast. It actually ended up impacting the northeastern part of the United States as well. And when it did, it did primarily in the form not only just of tornadoes, but also rain events. With those rain events, places like Mount Vernon had sewage coming back into homes. One family who's had problems for over 20 years, at this time, they had at least 8 feet of water in their basement. I was contacted recently by a designer, a person who has a lot of vintage clothing that provides this type of clothing to the motion picture and theater industry in New York. And the warehouse that she owns in Queens, along with other people who were business owners in this region, ended up having sewage running back into their homes and running back into these warehouses. And it destroyed a lot of her product. And the insurance companies would not cover it because wastewater is associated with flooding. And as a result, she's lost a lot of her product and is trying to determine how to replace it. Those are the kinds of issues that are going to become more common. But the way it came to the attention is because people in Lowndes County, Alabama, started speaking out about these things. We used to think that it was simply a plumbing issue, but it's more than a plumbing issue. But we're finding that, as in all cases, environmental justice communities, climate justice communities are the canaries in the coal mine, the warnings for all of us who feel safe right now, that we're not safe, and that we could ultimately start seeing these same failures ourselves. But the people in these environmental justice communities are seeing it first because they never got the right type of infrastructure in the first place that's failing. And then other communities are starting to see it because the infrastructure that was put in place is old. Also, it never took into account climate change. And climate change is an amplifier, like COVID, of all of these disparities and all these inequities, but it's also a magnifier of technological inadequacies that are existing around this country and around the world. So it's very, very important that we allow people in these communities to tell their stories so we can get to solutions. I've also learned in this process that it looks different in different areas. And so many people in the United States only know about what's in their area. They have not been to rural communities to see how rural communities are organized. And consequently, whenever they propose solutions, it's from an urban perspective, and they leave out the important factors that are necessary to address rural issues. So one of the first solutions I'm proposing is that if we talk about how we're going to solve these problems, I know the government oftentimes, whenever they do something, they seek comments. We need more than comments. We need real engagement. Real engagement means letting people that are in these communities sit at the table and let them be part of designing the solution, not just forcing some type of proposed solution on them from people who've never lived in those communities and don't have to live with the failures. Oftentimes, things are left out because if you haven't lived in an area, as I have, where you have not, first of all, had access to plumbing at all. We first moved to Lowndes County, we did not have indoor plumbing. So I know what it's like to use an outhouse. But those people that don't understand that, or don't understand what it's like to have a septic system and the sewage running back into their homes, will not understand not only the trauma that goes along with it, but also what it means to have these technological failures, what it means in terms of your health, what it means in terms of how you consume water and what you eat, because you don't want to go to the bathroom because you don't want to see it in your tub and you don't want to see it on the floor in your home. So these are things that are necessary for people to understand that are designing solutions. And that's why it's very important for people living in those communities to be sitting at the table to design what the solutions are. Because I know there are lots of blind sides to not being a part of the community and really understanding. And the academic approach has failed again and again. Also, there are things like systemic racism that factors into a lot of this. In Montgomery, Alabama, which is the capital of Alabama, in the city, there's a wastewater treatment authority. The wastewater treatment authority only provides wastewater treatment for a lot of Montgomery, but it has notably excluded communities, older Black communities that have been there, probably predating the sewage authority, yet their own septic systems that are failing. And I've actually gone to homes and seen where either the systems have just collapsed and no longer really function. One woman has a big hole in her backyard because the sewage the treatment doesn't work anymore. Yet it's going to cost anywhere from $17,000 or more to replace it. And that's only a temporary solution. Yet there are sewer mains within 600 feet of many of these homes. People are paying the wastewater authority, the water and sewage authority, a flat rate for sewage and water, yet the communities of color are denied access to that. Not all of the communities of color, but many of the older Black communities. Yet I have seen, when I was doing economic development for Lowndes County, when sewage went past these communities and went to the businesses that were located, and particularly Hyundai was built in an area that wasn't even part of the city, and they provide them with water and sewer service. Yet I was on a call recently where this was an example of the structures that prevent people from getting access. And the person who was speaking on behalf of the sewer authority basically said, we're going to choose the cheapest approach. That is why we have Flint. That is why we have Benton Harbor. And we have to move away from that and not feel that it's okay to keep repeating the same old mistakes over and over again because it's baked into our system through either structural inequalities like racism or just plain old selfishness and not being interested in making sure everyone has the access to water and sanitation. In addition to that, sitting at the table, it's also important that people that are interested in solutions actually spend time in these communities. One cannot helicopter in for a day or two and then understand all the complexities of what is going on, or look at some data that somebody put together that may not be accurate and they don't know. They just accept it because it comes from a university, and they have not done the kind of deep dive that needs to happen by spending time in the communities, learning from people that are there who are the real experts, and then combining that to try to find some real solutions. I really believe that solutions are there. I think the solutions are really the kinds of solutions that have allowed us to send a man to the moon, allowed us to go into outer space, to allow us to help people live on the space station. When they live on that space station, they still have the same bodily functions that they have. They have to have access to water. They have to have access to sanitation to keep from getting sick. Why don't we use some of those technologies? And what we are proposing to do through the Center for Rural Enterprise and Environmental Justice is to bring together people that are living in the community and dealing with these issues with people that have designed these same type of systems to work in outer space. Why is that important? When we look at our cell phones, that was technology that we had only imagined when I was a child. We saw that on the Jetsons, but now everybody has a cell phone. MRIs are something that were used that came from space age technology. Why don't we start looking at how we treat wastewater that way? Because in a place like Mount Vernon, it doesn't make sense to rip up every street in Mount Vernon, which has 100,000 people, to try to find 100-year-old clay pipes that are crumbling. Why don't we come up with something that could potentially be used in each and every home and provide the same type of benefit, and also provide clean water? And we have to stop throwing away everything and find out what we can reuse and recycle. And this is a part of that. And I think these environmental justice issues is going to lead us to the climate solutions that we need to have that will protect Mother Earth and protect humankind and human health. And as a result of those kind of inquiries and those type of partnerships and collaborations and thinking out of the box, I think we'll find a way to maybe reduce the carbon footprint, salvage what is happening in many of these communities, and make sure that we all have access to water and sanitation. What is happening in the world scares me today. I'm very concerned about 7 generations to come, but I'm also concerned about the generation to come after me, because the things that were predicted to happen in the future are happening right now. The wildfires in California, the droughts, the floods. I mean, a lot of these things are happening. There's discussion about food that might not exist because of heat islands. It's getting too hot in a lot of places. We have these melting ice caps. My friends that serve with me on the Weejack from Alaska are talking about what is happening with the melting permafrost there and the impact it's having on their water and sanitation that is not prepared to deal with what is going on now. I just left Scotland, and even there are concerns about what is happening with climate change. So, and not because they're hosting COP26, but they're also dealing with a lot of these issues. And I met a member of parliament there who is from the UK. His name is David Lammy. And David talks about environmental justice issues that are happening within the UK. They're happening around the world. But another part of the solution is what this administration has proposed, which is the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. For the first time in history, people that are on the ground engaged in environmental justice are advising the White House about how to deal with these issues. No, it's not perfect. However, we're building a car and driving it at the same time. So I think that it is at least offers a blueprint for going forward that will probably keep changing and modifying as we find best practices and ways to address this. But at the seat of all of that is having people sitting at the table and helping to develop those solutions. So I am really, I feel delighted to be here and to be able to present my perspective. And I encourage you, if you're interested in learning more about this issue, to read my book, Waste: One Woman's Fight Against America's Dirty Secret. In addition, we're engaged in a partnership with the Guardian newspaper, where we're looking to uncover America's dirty secret, and we're asking people from around the country to report. There's a website that you can go to and report issues around wastewater so that we can document this. And without having the real documentation, we're not going to get to the solutions in places that really need it. So please go to that website if you have information on wastewater issues that are happening in your area, so we can start documenting and investigating them and this will help policymakers come up with some real tangible solutions to address it. So again, this is my pleasure to be here today, and I'm looking forward to dialogue. In conclusion, make sure that the people that are part of the problem, that are experiencing the problem every day, are sitting at the table and also helping to develop the solutions. That's how we're going to get to the human right to water and sanitation for all. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ms. Flowers. Really appreciate you joining us today. As a young boy, I collected comic books, and I was always enthralled by superheroes. those with extraordinary powers that, made a difference in the lives of others. And, I don't think it's a stretch to say, you're a contemporary superhero. The movement that you've built is changing the lives of millions, tens of millions of Americans across the country. And I think with all great superhero narratives, I'm always interested in the origin stories. And so I'd love it if you would walk us through that journey of yours. You mentioned you had a background as an educator, and then got involved in economic development. Of course, I know your family has a background in advocacy in the civil rights movement, but I'm curious, from your trajectory, what was that moment when you really started on the journey that you find yourself on?
Wow. Well, I think I started on the journey a long time ago. Well, thank you for that compliment. I really don't see myself as a superhero. I'm just as a mom that's trying to knock down mountains and climb them,
I love it.
To make sure that all children have access to water and sanitation. But I think it kind of started as a child. I grew up at a time when it was a very turbulent time in this country's history. Prior to moving to Lowndes County, my family lived in Birmingham. And I just remember my father coming home crying because the president had been killed. Then I also remember there was so much turbulence around, and this must have been around, 1963? And I was 5. And I just remembered the church being bombed and the children were killed. They were my age. So all of these things were happening. A president was killed. His brother was killed. He was running for president. Dr. Martin.
Birmingham, right? It must have been, you grew up in Birmingham?
I was born in Birmingham, and then we moved. No, I actually grew up in Lowndes County, but I was born in Birmingham. Okay. We were there for a period of time when I was 5. Okay. And under. But it was, but all of that was kind of a turbulent time for me, and impacted me in ways that I probably didn't know. Yeah. And I always wanted to be, I remember growing up, there were songs, like, I would like to teach the world to live in perfect harmony and all that. And I always wanted to be a part of making that a reality. Yeah. So I guess the trajectory, I just remembered I was always involved in movements even as a child. I have to change the name of my high school. Before I graduated from high school, fought for that, getting rid of the superintendent, getting rid of my principal. And then later, as a teacher, fought for the rights of students to be able to learn. And I was, recently reflecting on General Powell. I was involved in a movement called the 21st Century Youth Leadership Movement that had its foundings in Selma. But every school that I went to, I organized a chapter, and in the process met someone who was connected to General Powell, who was married to someone from Birmingham, Alabama, and invited him to come to my school. And I actually posted that picture in honor of his memory, because he was just so moving and was almost like everybody's dad when he came, and stayed longer than he was supposed to. And we were just, I've always been in awe of him. But I call myself like the Black female Forrest Gump, because all these things helped to shape me. And ultimately, when I left teaching, which I felt was activism, being, teacher to me, being a teacher is like being an activist, but getting paid for it. So when I found out that people were being arrested in Lowndes County for not being able to afford an on-site septic system, I think that changed the trajectory of everything that I was doing, because I realized you're not going to have sustainable economic development without access to sanitation. And one is not going to be able to have good health without access to sanitation. And obviously, with the hookworm study, we know that it can also have an impact on a child's ability to learn as well.
Yeah, you mentioned Selma. One of the great privileges of my life was working as the regional field director in Selma for the Obama campaign back in 2008. And you learn real quickly the deep storied history of Lowndes County in the civil rights movement. The Lowndes County Freedom Organization, I think 55 years, 1966, that really kind of began what snowballed into, I think what most people understand became the Black Panther Party. And really, I'm curious, you talk a lot about the sanitation crisis being a human rights crisis. How has your background as an educator informed your advocacy? You're one of the most compelling storytellers, which is critical to enlisting people into a movement. But I'm wondering, how that background has helped shape your ability to mobilize people.
Well, I had the opportunity to sit at the feet of masters and learn, as a child, people that were teachers and activists, and part of it is taking time. I was just explaining to someone recently that when one goes into a community, especially a rural community, you can't go in with a timeline, because chances are, you got to sit there and you got to listen to them talk. And they're the experts, and then develop that relationship and trust. And I think that that's one of the things that has helped me do well. And I grew up around a lot of storytellers. In the African tradition, there's a griot that tells stories. And I think my father was kind of a griot, but I've always enjoyed, even when I was a child, I enjoyed being around older people and listening and learning, because one can always learn from the people reciting, the stories of their experiences. And I was a history major and a history teacher. So all of that, I think, helped me. But it also helped me, I think the thing that helped me the most is being a country girl. Being from the country, you have to learn how to get along with people. And sometimes, neighbors have to depend on each other. It doesn't matter how they vote at the end of the day, but when my neighbor's house burns down, I got to go and help my neighbor. And that is what happened in a place like Lowndes County, despite the fact that some people from Lowndes County probably have a history of maybe intimidation and racial terror, their family members. But today we're working to try to resolve issues. And I think that that's important of how we're going to get out of this mess that we're in this country.
One of the, I think, most extraordinary parts of your journey is understanding how you've managed to do what most, frankly, advocates are either unwilling or unable to do, and it's work across the aisles and find advocates, champions of solutions, regardless of political parties. I know you served on the Biden-Sanders Unity Task Force. You worked with Jeff Sessions back in the day when he was a U.S. Senator and an Attorney General. This is, we're in the midst of political dysfunction. It's I think the challenge we find ourselves in is that people are unwilling to come together and actually find a way to work together. What lessons of what you've been able to accomplish do you think could be used to help us address what remains a crisis for tens of millions of Americans across the country?
Well, I think one of the things that we can learn from is look at football. Look at Alabama football and Auburn football.
Okay, all right.
Now, that there are people that are coming together that vote differently and probably worship differently, but when it comes to that football game, they're all cheering for the same thing.
Yeah.
So what I try to do is find something that we have in common first, and I start there. And then I have the hard conversations. Because one of the things about dealing with sustainable development goals and human rights is that we have to look at the humanity in everybody. And I try to find the humanity in each and every person that I'm dealing with. And I don't argue. I'm not going to argue with anyone. But those that are willing to talk and accept and respect my humanity, we can find some things in common, and may not agree on the solution to solving the problem, but we can agree that it's a problem.
Right.
And that's a start.
Well, looking at the current infrastructure bill, which has received bipartisan support, are you hopeful about what's currently in that bill of adequately addressing where things currently stand, or is it a drop in the bucket?
Oh yeah, it's certainly a drop in the bucket. I mean, it is at its best. It's a drop in the bucket. It's a down payment on what we need to do.
Yeah.
And it is certainly a beginning. It is not the end, and it's not going to solve everything, because so many things were left out, and there are
Right.
things that we're still pushing for. However, I think it is a beginning, because it's better than having nothing at all, and we have to start somewhere.
What was left out? What should be kind of the complementary piece of legislation that's kind of the next battle to be waged?
Well, I think that if I start there, listing a whole list, but I'll start at least with what I'm interested in and what I've been working on, and that's that everybody having the right to clean water and sanitation, not just removing lead pipes. We need to also make sure that the water and air is not contaminated by pollution. We also, and that's industrial pollution, because a lot of that is also attributed to climate change. But certainly making sure that our infrastructure that deals with water and sanitation is addressed, and making sure that there's funding available, that everybody should have access to it, whether they can afford it or not. It shouldn't be based on what their personal incomes are. And the travesty in all of this is that the people that tend to get government help are people that can afford to pay for the solutions, and the people that need to get government help can't get it. And that's a paradigm that we need to change.
And part of that is the challenge of how a lot of these federal programs are funded, the necessary matching grants that a lot of these communities aren't able to put up. We talk about, obviously the climate crisis is an overall theme of this discussion with investment. I think there's always a focus too much on kind of the climate mitigation side, and not so much the climate adaptation side. When it comes to the public health implications of the sanitation crisis, I know you partnered with Baylor on really analyzing tropical parasites that are finding their way in the United States. I'd love to learn more about that and the study you all conducted.
Well, I had my own personal experience where I was bitten by mosquitoes and broke out in a rash, and the doctors couldn't determine what it was. And, when I took the blood test, everything came back good. Yeah. But, that led me to the question, what if there are diseases in this country that American doctors are not trained to look for it? And that led me to Dr. Peter Hotez, who everybody knows now. But back then, he was very accessible, and I Googled him because he wrote an op-ed in the New York Times talking about tropical diseases being on our shores now. And I saw that he mentioned sanitation. And when we first connected, he said, every time I bring up these issues, they want to blame immigration for it. I said, well, I can take you to a place where people haven't gone out of the country, so they can't say that. And consequently, he said, we're going to look for hookworm, because I had never really understood what hookworm was before then. And we collected fecal soil and blood samples, and as well as water samples. And they went to they took them to their lab, and they diagnosed them and found DNA using PCR technology, and found DNA for hookworm and other tropical parasites. And at the time we did it, it was so explosive. I know that we held the story for 3 years because it had to be peer reviewed, and the Guardian agreed to hold the story. And when it did drop, it got international attention because it was in the United States. And the other significant thing about it is that the state health department denied that it was denied that. They said that the PCR technology that we were using was not approved by the Food and Drug Administration, which is really interesting, because you can't now. I just came back from England, came back from the UK, and part of going there, I had to take a PCR test for COVID. So they were very short-sighted. But I think the significant thing about this story is that this was an example of the community coming together, because somebody got to trust you a lot to give you their fecal sample. So it was an example of the community wanting to find a solution. They knew that there was a problem. We didn't know the answer, but that gave us an answer. And we feel that as we do more research, which we are doing across other states, collecting soil samples, that we're going to find more evidence of the need for sanitation infrastructure, and seeing that it could negatively impact the health of people that are living without it.
I've read some of the kind of the anecdotes you've shared about how expensive it is to put sanitation systems with some of these homes and in some of these communities. Given the public health implications, I think it's an important narrative that you're changing about viewing this less as an expense and more as an investment, especially given the implications, the consequences, and how that's costing not just families and communities, but hospital systems that are having them to deal with this. Do you, I'm curious from, we talk about climate migrants, you don't tend to think about, here in the United States. And if you do, it's usually thinking about, coastal communities, sea level rise, and how that's going to affect some of those communities. Given the state of the soil and given the cost of sanitation systems, is that a conversation that you've begun having about whether we find ourselves in a situation where there are parts of our country, given the climate crisis and given the cost of even that investment in sanitation systems, where we need to be thinking down the road about whether it even makes sense to have so many of these communities stay where they are?
No, I don't think about it like that, because most of the United States is rural. Most people are living in cities.
Yeah.
And they're having wastewater problems too. So the question becomes, do we come up, if we look at the vast US from coast to coast, and most of it is not even occupied by, it's not urban, it's rural. And a lot of those areas aren't settled for the same reasons. They don't have the infrastructure. Should we be investing in infrastructure for those people that's going to have to move from the cities? I'm turning this question around. It's going to have to move from the cities to other areas because they're no longer sustainable. I mean, we saw some examples of that with COVID, when people actually had to leave New York and other places because they were afraid to be there because they were densely populated, and COVID was ravaging those areas. COVID is just a canary in the coal mine. We're going to see more pandemics with the climate crisis, but also we need to be able to put in place the infrastructure to address with the fact that people are going to have to move from these coastal areas like New York, where you can't buy flood insurance now. Where are people going to move?
Right.
But until we deal with the infrastructure, we have to start thinking ahead of the game and not wait until we're in crisis and trying to figure out how we get our way out of it. So I think the way to look at this is to look at how do we develop the type of technology that will allow people that's going to have to move because of sea level rise, like people in Miami and people in Louisiana, and even in Alabama. Sea level rise is more than just the land being inundated by floods. Sea level rise means that the water tables are rising too, especially in the Northeast. And where the water tables are rising, the infrastructure is failing. I'm hearing from people in Pennsylvania, for an example, who are on septic tanks, and those septic systems are also failing and running back into their homes. We're hearing from people in the Midwest that are saying the same thing. It's happening across the United States. So it's not going to be practical to move everybody, but it will be practical to get technologies that will work. Because at the end of the day, people are suffering right now, and the healthcare disparities or the health impacts, we have not even begun to address them yet.
Well, we've talked about infrastructure and investment. This is a perfect kind of segue to innovation. You recently moved near Huntsville Home Space Command. Can you talk about why that move was important and kind of how the role of innovation is shaping your work now?
Well, I think it's very important to look at innovation. Growing up in rural communities, we had to make do with what we had, and everything we had, we reused it. Now it's popular for everybody to do it. My mother used aluminum foil so much, I thought that aluminum foil was supposed to be reused over and over again. You never threw it away. Every jelly jar became a jar that was used for something else. The tins for the pie pans were used over and over again. And then there are people like Ben Wallace's brother. Ben Wallace just got inducted he was inducted into the NBA Hall of Fame. He's from Lowndes County, Alabama. And Ben's brother runs a farm. He never went to college. But the equipment on that farm would not be able to operate without him, because he's learned how to fabricate parts to keep 30 and 40-year-old equipment still running. those are the kinds of people that need to be sitting down at the table with aerospace engineers to try to figure out how we treat wastewater in a way that we have never done it before. And I think that is until we flip that engineering paradigm, we're going to continue to engineer solutions that will keep failing, but the money will be spent and the people that came up with these so-called solutions will be gone and the communities will still be suffering. So I feel that coming here to the Huntsville area where there are lots of scientists and engineers, and I think that science does factor into the solutions, but I also think that common sense factors into the solutions as well. And bringing them together here, which is the home of the U.S. Space Command now, in Huntsville, Alabama, the Redstone Arsenal, we'll be able to find within, and I'm predicting within 5 years, a real working solution that can not only be deployed here in the United States, but around the world and other places that are having the same issues with sanitation.
Yeah, I'm curious. This is an issue that I'm sure you found shocks a lot of people, even knowing that it was an issue here in the United States, let alone in their backyard. How does someone find out about the state of the sanitation crisis in their communities? What's that? Is there a resource for that? What can we do to be more informed about what's happening in our backyard?
That's a very good question, because what we're finding is that there's no real database there's no collective database on this. So the Center for Rural Enterprise and Environmental Justice, we've actually started a wastewater fellowship program where we're going to have college students. We did the prototype this summer. We have college students assigned to states that will be looking into and collecting data on wastewater, especially on-site wastewater systems that are in each state. Because so we can quantify that and where they're located, because that data, there's no central database with that information. In addition to that, we're hoping that our partnership with the Guardian newspaper, where people have already reached out to us. We've heard from people, for an example, in the Hamptons, because their on-site septic systems are failing too. And we've heard from places, Centerville, Illinois, outside of St. Louis, where their systems are failing. And even Mount Vernon, it was because of the Guardian project that someone reached out to us from Mount Vernon to tell us about the problems that they were having. We actually visited and saw it firsthand. So that is one way people can be informed. I think the simplest thing to do is to read the Guardian series, and also to ask in your own neighborhoods. I think one of the things that we don't do, and I think this is what has made this problem so in the closet, if you will, I can't think of a better way to describe it, is because of the shame associated with talking about sewage and our own bodily functions and sanitation. And I think I'm hoping that what we've done is remove the shame from talking about sanitation. So one way in which people can do it is to talk to their neighbors about what kind of issues are they having? Because now people feel free to talk to us and say, it's in my backyard. And folk were not talking to each other about it before. And now we see that more people are talking about it. But we want to quantify this information so that policymakers can know that their areas have this problem too, and they can also work on solutions. I think we'll have a better infrastructure package as it relates to sanitation when we have some numbers to say that this is how many that are in your area as well, and this is what you need to do to address it.
This movement you began in Lowndes County has, of course, snowballed into a national movement. You mentioned earlier the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So for people tuning in, these are 17 SDGs that provide a framework that really establish the priorities and those global goals for governments around the world to address. SDG 6, clean water and sanitation is one of the signature SDGs. As your movement is built, and you've I know begun connecting with communities across the country, indigenous communities in the Hamptons, the whole spectrum, you're also beginning to be plugged into a global movement. I'm curious what that experience has been like, and if there are other organizations or leaders, movements around the world that have also kind of helped inform what you're doing here in the United States.
Well, yes, we've been plugged into the United Nations. One of the things that we did was we invited the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty to come to Lowndes County in 2017. And at that particular time, I don't think they really understood the connection between poverty and the lack of sanitation. And when Dr. Austin actually went and saw it in Lowndes County, it was very clear. We've also invited like people from the New Poor People's Campaign, Reverend Dr. William Barber, who just came from the Vatican, talking about these issues around poverty, and this is one of them. So I think through the global efforts, when Dr. Austin made his presentation before the United Nations about his official visit to the United States, it was at a time when Neely had just left the UN Human Rights Council, and her choice of words was that she called them a cesspool. So it set the stage for Dr. Austin when he presented his report to talk about the cesspools that he saw in Alabama. And that, of course, he was talking to leaders from around the world. I personally have heard from people from various African nations and also from India, where they still have open defecation. And they've talked about the wastewater problems. I talked with a young man who is now studying in the United States. He was studying, he was at Columbia University in their human rights clinic, which we had partnered with. And he talked about living in Lagos, Nigeria. And he had to move out of the apartment because the sewage was coming back into the apartment. So these are, it sounds very familiar because it is part of the same problem. And hopefully whatever solutions we come up with can help places around the world. And they definitely are reaching out. But a lot of our work has been done through representation at the United Nations.
The Big Bang community is a very diverse, eclectic group of corporate executives, philanthropists, foundations, activists, community leaders. A lot of those folks are tuning in right now. Given your work and really the scalable impact that you represent, how can this network, this community specifically support your work, your organizations? What are the greatest needs right now? I know you issued a great call to action, I think, for individuals at the local level, but in terms of really giving you the support and resources you need, what are the greatest needs right now?
Well, I think the greatest needs for us are to be able to provide the funding to make sure that we can have students in all 50 states documenting this information. And in some cases, the information is not free. We have to pay for it to get access to it, even if we make a FOIA request. Also, we're looking for funding to fund the technological challenge that we're doing with the aerospace industry to try to bring together people from the space program and people from community to find some technological solutions. And that's going to cost money to do that. So. Right. And then, of course, the third thing they can do is look at Justice 40, which is coming out of the WEJAC, which says that at least 40% of the investments should go into overburdened and under-resourced communities. A lot of those communities, as you mentioned earlier, are going to need matches for those grants, and they don't have the money. So don't leave it sitting on the table because they don't have the money. It could be a great investment because ultimately, if you don't see anything else out of it, I think just to improve in human health. And one of the things that COVID has taught us is that it doesn't just stop in one community. If we have an outbreak somewhere, it could end up going around the world. And sewage is one of those things that if we look historically at where diseases have started, it started where sanitation was not treated adequately.
WEJAC, that's the inaugural White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council.
Yes.
To remember. With that, I want to, we'll wrap it up. I hope everyone tuning in, and I guess, Ms. Flowers, in order to get that support, if folks want to provide funding support and reach out to you and your organization, is there a best website that they could go to or contact information? How do we start driving some inbound leads?
They can go to www.crees.org. That's our website. We're also accessible through Twitter. They can reach out to me directly and I can put them in touch with our development people. So we tweet, we're on Facebook, we're on LinkedIn, so all the social media sites, Instagram,
awesome. Right.
or they can simply just go to the organization and go to info and send an email, and we'll respond to it.
Well, and of course, beyond that, I hope everyone buys Waste, the book that you came out this year. It's an extraordinary insight, not just into the movement, but your own personal story and how we got to where we are, which is a really exciting moment in time addressing the sanitation crisis. The last thing I'll say, Ms. Flowers, I was watching an interview that you gave a couple years ago, and you had noted that if you're driving on the highways, near Lowndes County, there's no signage that really shows you how even to get there. And, beyond students of the civil rights movement, I think what's really exciting is that you've put Lowndes County on the map, not just for the tens of millions of Americans that are benefiting from this national movement addressing the sanitation crisis, but tens of millions of Americans who aren't suffering from it, but now are going to be getting involved. So thank you for joining us at the Big Bang Conference, and it was an absolute pleasure talking with you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Well, good morning. So much to think about, so much to reflect on. This has been a truly inspiring 3 days of learning thus far. My name is Anthony Yano. I am the VP of Development and Strategy for SVP Dallas. I recently joined the organization after 20 years in industry in a variety of roles. And over those 20 years, I've had the opportunity to travel extensively overseas to India and China, Mexico, Brazil, and many other countries in Latin America. And I had the opportunity to witness abject poverty in many of these countries. As I reflect on what we've learned over the last few days, it is truly beyond belief and honestly quite disheartening that in the 21st century in the United States of America, still the richest country in the world, we are dealing with environmental injustices surrounding things like basic sanitation, access to clean and drinking water, as we learn about Flint and Benton Harbor in Michigan, and of course, equitable access to healthy, affordable food to address food deserts. The events earlier this year with the Texas winter freeze added, as they say, insult to injury, as the most vulnerable community, significantly poor, underrepresented communities in urban and rural settings had very few options as they weathered blackouts, unprecedented cold, limited resources writ large. The pandemic has further highlighted the well-documented inequalities that we've been hearing about over the last 3 days. So I implore you to grab a bite to eat and join us again in a few minutes. You'll have the option to choose from 3 very insightful panels that will delve deeper into the issues we've been talking about related to environmental injustices. I will come back at around 2 o'clock to wrap up the virtual component of our program and tee up our in-person program at Paul Quinn College. Delighted to be here with you. Looking forward to meeting many of you at Paul Quinn tomorrow. Thank you.